So now it's time for us to get into the event that kick-started the revolution. March 5th, today in history, 1770, the Boston Massacre.
A wigmaker's apprentice taunts a British officer. A private standing outside of the customs house calls out that the apprentice should be more respectful. They exchange insults. The apprentice pokes the officer in the chest, and the private loses his patience and clubs the apprentice with his musket stock. The blow draws a crowd, and the situation deteriorates. Someone rings the church bell, signaling fire. Civilians, confused, pour into the streets. 50 Bostonians, led by Crispus Attucks, a free man of African and Native American heritage, press around the private. He retreats to the steps of the customs house, calling for help. 7 soldiers, led by Captain Thomas Preston, come to his aid. They push their way through the crowd and form a semicircle on the steps, muskets loaded and bayonets fixed. They're surrounded by several hundred people, some armed with ropemakers' clubs. The crowd throws snowballs, ice, and razor-sharp oyster shells. They chant, "Fire! Fire! Fire!" Just then, from the darkness behind the soldiers, someone shouts, "Fire!" At that same moment, something strikes one of the soldiers, knocking him down. When he rises, he fires. The others fire a ragged volley, one at a time. Preston shouts for them to halt. The soldiers comply, confused. Hadn't he given the order? With dawning horror, they realize what's happened. 3 civilians, including Attucks, lay dead in the snow. 2 more will die that night. The injured cluster around the customs house steps. The crowd surges away, but continues to gather in nearby streets.
What are the colonists feeling? They're falling over, they're running away.
Scared.
They're scared.
Terrified.
Terrified. Terror. Yeah.
Right? Terror.
They're under threat.
Scared.
Yeah. I want you to notice something. You know those ASPCA commercials for just 99 cents a day. You too can help a starving animal. You know the ones I'm talking about, right? There was no dog at this event, but Paul Revere knew that the inclusion of an animal in danger would further fire up the hearts of the colonists. Everyone loves dogs. Even back then, everyone loves dogs. I can go right now and find a letter a Roman soldier left at the grave of his dog, saying that my world is not the same without me. We've always loved dogs. This is a propaganda technique. It makes the British look worse. It's almost like putting a baby in the crowd, right? Also the faces. We established that the British had been having clubs, glass, stones thrown at them, right? Do you see any injuries on the British?
No.
Does this make it look like they simply fired on the crowd?
Yeah.
Is that what Paul Revere wants you to think?
Yeah.
Yes. Paul Revere is a revolutionary. He wants the people fired up. He wants them to go to war. In the same way that Paul Revere is trying to fire up the spirits of the American colonists after this. Samuel Adams is doing the same. This is the guy who organized the Boston Tea Party. There's just been a massacre in his city. The battle for public perception began on March 8th, 3 days after the event. I believe for us, March 8th would be Saturday, right? He led a funeral procession for the victims of the Boston Massacre. Witnesses suggest that 10,000 people, almost 67% of the entire city's population, attended the funeral parade. The fallen were Samuel Gray, Samuel Maverick, James Caldwell, and Crispus Attucks. They were the first 4 victims. Adams consciously guided the procession through Boston using pageantry to vilify British oppression. He promoted colonial unity over British usurpation of rights, and the procession ended at the Granary Burying Ground, where Gray, Maverick, Caldwell, and Attucks were laid to rest in the same burial plot. 7 days later, a 5th victim of the massacre, Patrick Carr, was also buried in the same plot. With the victims laid to rest, attention now turned to the soldiers who had committed this act. Bostonians wanted Captain Thomas Preston and the 7 soldiers tried and convicted quickly. But Governor Thomas Hutchinson delayed. Finally, in October, almost half a year later, Thomas Preston took the stand. I need you guys to understand how crazy this is. The British soldiers that fired on that crowd served King George, okay? They are British. They are being forced into a court that is run by the colonies. Legally, the American colonies have no authority to prosecute the British soldiers. It's like trying to prosecute someone from another country. But the American colonists don't care. They want justice. There has been blood in their streets. Their families have died. So, who's heard of John Adams? Not that big of a deal. He's only the second president of the United States. But here's the thing. Before John Adams was president, before there was a revolution, John Adams was an American. And he was still doing his thing. He was a defense attorney, a lawyer. And John Adams believed, much like a lot of the Enlightenment thinkers, that there needed to be justice for all. Everyone deserved representation in a court of law. Everyone had a right to face their accuser. We hear a lot of these ideas in the Bill of Rights, in the Constitution of the United States of America. Here's where those ideas begin in America.
The day of the trial. Preston and his soldiers stand in a courtroom, packed floor to ceiling. Adams encourages the jury to look beyond their prejudice and recognize that these men, outnumbered by an angry mob, had a right to self-defense. If he could prove that they'd been provoked, then they were guilty of manslaughter, not murder. The first witness takes the stand. Adams gets him to admit that he had carried a sword that night, planning to decapitate the soldiers. Other witnesses testify about the violent provocations the soldiers endured. A prosecution witness claims he saw Preston give an order to fire while standing behind his men. But Adams produces testimony from a witness who had had his hand on Preston's shoulder when the shooting started. That witness swears Preston never gave an order and was standing in front of the soldiers. Two more witnesses swear the shout of "fire" did not come from Preston. Testimony is over. Time for closing remarks. Adams shuffles his papers, takes a deep breath, and addresses the jury. "I will enlarge no more on the evidence," he says, "but submit it to you, gentlemen. Facts are stubborn things, and whatever may be our wishes, our inclinations, or the dictates of our passions, they cannot alter the state of facts and evidence, nor is the law less stable than the fact. If an assault was made to endanger their lives, the law is clear. They had right to kill in their own defense." Adams had made a persuasive case, but was it enough to overcome the anger, however justified, of his fellow colonists? The jury deliberates for 2.5 hours. At stake is not only the soldiers' lives, but Adams' reputation. Finally, they deliver their verdict. Not guilty. Captain Preston and 6 of his soldiers would be acquitted. 2 were convicted of manslaughter, not murder, and branded on the thumb with an M. If they broke the law again, the mark would ensure a harsher sentence. And in the 1780s, while minister to Great Britain, he noticed a familiar face on the streets of London. Captain Thomas Preston. These 2 men, passing on the street, had helped ignite a revolution.
The part I took in the defense of Captain Preston and the soldiers procured me anxiety and great obloquy. In other words, it was a headache. It was, however, one of the most gallant, generous, manly, and disinterested actions of my whole life, and one of the best pieces of service I ever rendered my country. Judgment of death against those soldiers would have been as foul a stain upon this country as the executions of the Quakers and the witches anciently. As the evidence was, the verdict of the jury was exactly right. John Adams risked his business. He risked his reputation, he risked his wealth, and to an extent, he risked the health and safety of his family to represent these British soldiers, because everyone deserves a fair shot at justice.